Hello again. This is day 4, and again, I'm not imagining I'm getting a lot of views live, but I'm trying to learn how to use the system. If people think there's a better time for doing that, comment in the comments below. I know this is, what is it, 9:30 East Coast time, and so a lot of people are not up for watching a live feed on this. If people think it's a better time between 2 and 4 p.m. on a weekday or a noon time, I don't know what the preference is for that kind of thing. But I am getting more familiar with how to use this YouTube Live feature. So as I go forward doing other projects like this, I will be more familiar with it at least. And that to me is a win in that case. Um, this is day 4, I believe, of working on this book, which I have uh, come to call my what's my working title? The How to Know When You're Wrong. How to Know When You're Wrong. It seems a little pedantic and self-important. And while the topic could very easily be done that way, that is the last thing I want to do with this. I want to take this topic out of that realm. So part of that is, like, as I've mentioned, I think in the last 2, maybe even all 3 previous recordings on this topic, my aim is sort of to roughly do. Well, I mentioned it sort of like as a good way to describe it as being like Pokemon monster entries for each of the different biases, ethical, moral wrongs, and fallacies. And the more I think about it, the more I really like that design, even to the point where it would be so much extra work to do it. But I kind of want to have like a little monster illustration for each one, some little gremlin or critter of some kind doing in a pose or with a symbol or something that would indicate that it is doing this wrong. And then like the entry should be, I'm feeling like how to identify it would be to give an example of it being done. So like uh, ad ad hominem attack, do like a quote that would be an ad hominem attack. Um, and doing that followed by a more in-depth discussion of what it is, to define it, spell it out. It's well, not really history, but it's sort of like its function and uh, like malfunction, I guess. Um, and that's going to be some of the more creative writing aspect of this, because as you go through researching a lot of this stuff, clearly it's a whole nother language. Nobody talks like that to other people. And so if you're trying to help somebody understand what that is, using jargony words that nobody has a grasp of as a general member of human populations, nobody uses some of these words. Nobody knows what most of them means. I'm gonna see if I can pull up an example here that just like, really? That's how we're gonna refer to this? Let's see if I got this back up through the list. Okay. Inferring evaluative conclusions from purely factual premises. That's what? There's a better way to say that. So, like an is ought fallacy would be a statement about what is on the basis of claims about what ought to be. That's a little bit easier to understand, but there's still like with the illustrative example as like how to identify it when it happens, um, sort of like what to look for when looking for this thing in the wild. That gives context to later being able to give a more human linguistic approach to this topic so that it's something you can say to your brother-in-law to help him understand why the argument he's trying to use to support his case, you might be supporting him in the argument, but saying like, well, you can't use that because that sort of brings into question whether or not your argument is valid if you're using invalid ways of validating it. So doing that with this, you can't use um, some of these just absolutely absurdly worded examples. Like I'm trying to find a really good one because that was it's early on and there are different categories of them. So like let's uh oh affirming a disjunct, concluding that one disjunct of a logical disjunction must be false because the other disjunct is true. What? Like if you're not somebody who's regularly studying the bases of these uh, conversations and the breakdowns of these aspects of fallacies and logic, that means nothing. You have learned nothing from that description. And I don't want to use stuff that doesn't make it understandable from examining it. And that's part of the reason why, like, doing the example of what's happening and then a longer, like, big paragraph that puts it into layman's terms, essentially, that helps anybody understand it. It's a bigger written text using simpler terms that are not jargony, and it can be written out better between the example and the definition. Writing it in a way that makes sense and communicates the context and the terms in a layman's terms sort of way is the important part. And then following that at the end, we can classify them because we have a lot of stuff that's. I do feel like the part of me that likes to break things down into you know evenly distribute and like sorting M&Ms almost. I kind of feel like I want to have a little bit from each category. So you have things like in the morals, you have principles of personal ethics, principles of business ethics, and it's basically morals would be personal, professional, and global. Global is a little more not sure if people can really agree on those. And then, like biases, you have belief in behavioral, social, and memory based. And so those are sort of like families. And those are the ones that I've seen them broken down into. I'm sure there's other ways of categorizing them. And then, like fallacies, have the formal fallacies, which there are 17. I'm pretty sure I'm going to use all 17 formal fallacies in uh, the first volume. The second volume, the informal fallacies by far in number the formal fallacies. But so like formal fallacies have like the three categories that I saw or I presented. Most times I saw them as propositional, quantification, and formal syllogistic. I've never said that word out loud. Syllogistic. Um, that's again, some of these maybe need to be translated. I don't know. And then informal, you have relevance fallacies, questionable cause, faulty generalization, and improper premise. And then there is an actual conditional fallacies where I think it's like 5 to 7 potential fallacies for that. And those those are like they're not always a fallacy. Sometimes they're well, I guess technically they're still a fallacy, but they're still potentially valid to use them. That like it's discrimination, but sometimes necessary discrimination for the application that's being examined. I, that's sort of hard to explain. Um, but it's a category of like appeal to authority. Well, yeah, if you want to hold an argument about whether or not global warming is an issue, maybe you should talk to climate scientists and not chiropractors. Like people who have authority in climate studies are more likely to be informed. So, like, it can be valid in some cases. Um, but, appealing to authority as if saying, like, well, it must be true because they're a doctor, when dealing with somebody who's telling you the mercury in your fillings are poisoning your system, let's not just award them it must be true just because they've got an MD at the end of their. I mean, there's some doctors who really shouldn't be giving advice on things that they clearly have a weird worldview on. There are doctors, you can find a doctor who will tell you not to vaccinate your children, but that's not because vaccines are dangerous. It's because they hold a personal belief that is a fallacy. So, their authority doesn't immediately make them valid in all their statements. So there are ways so those are conditional. Under certain conditions, it's a fallacy to award them that, but it's also perfectly valid in certain circumstances. And that's where it comes into discussing also um, how to recognize a fallacy and how to manage them. Sometimes you're just not going to be able to solve it. It's going to be there. Um, but in the cases of biases, there's debiasing, which are techniques for mitigating bias. In I debate whether or not I want to do a chapter heading for biases with a brief description of debiasing practices, or if ideas and examples of debiasing for each individual bias would be important. And I may do maybe a little bit of both. Because each chapter, like the morals, the biases, and the fallacies, I can see giving like a 2 to 4 page uh, preface to the topics, the individual ones as we go. And as I'm going through my list of my big compilation, I'm debating how many I want to put in each chapter. Because another part of me, like, aside from wanting to say, like, well, I should have, 20 from uh, um, informal and 17 from formal because that's how many there are informal fallacies, and the different like the I should do proportional pieces from memory, behavioral, and I'm already forgetting them. Uh, uh, from the memory, social, and behavioral biases, do I want to include like 10 from each? My inclination is to sort them in scales. It's just kind of like, well, the biggest group with the most commonly encountered aspects would get 45, and then the next one should get 30, and the next one after that should get 20. And but I feel like I need to really just appreciate each list and category and family as they are, and find the ones that are more likely to be encountered, even if they don't break down in an even way. But the reason I'm bringing this up is there's also a tendency for me to look at, for the categories. There's, I think it's 184 biases, and then there are, I think it was 143 fallacies, and some of those are like subcategories within categories. So like one fallacy will have 4 or 5 derivative fallacies that are within that family, that they fall within that overheading. But it's sort of like, again, switching back to Pokemon, it's sort of like looking at, this is Eevee and this is what is it, the electric one, the water one, the leaf one. Um, so it's sort of like that, and I don't know if I want to include them all on the same page. I think I want to break them up, but I can put them down as evolutions of. But the reason I bring this up this time is, if there are 184 biases and there are 143 fallacies, do I want to do 90 biases and, what is it, 71, 72 fallacies? I mean, the moral keystones, they're a little more like the keystone versions. I'm sure you can break them down further and give more examples and split it up into different categories and more. But um, doing doing the 20 some odd for morals is easy. That'll just get eaten up in the first volume. Now there is a new theory approach, a new approach to doing moral classifications, that has 7 principles based off of I think it's like 7 moral principles that are universal based off of human cooperation. And it's an interesting read, but I think that could be like a follow up. That could be volume 2 addressing that one. Going more with the personal ethics, business ethics, and global ethics gets me about 20. And that's a good number for ethical, moral wrongs for volume 1. And uh, but the trick with the biases and fallacies is, do you go for an even 100 because it's a nice even number for each, or I mean, in that the next book that leaves 43 fallacies and 84 biases, or do you evenly split it, close to evenly split them between the books? And I guess that's partly going to come down to the most relevant. Like if biases, if you go through the list of biases and it takes you 110 to get all the really key ones that we should all pay attention to, and then volume 2 is the 70 something to clean up the rest. I don't know. I'm not sure which way I would prefer to do that. I mean, I've built my list. I've started to, come up with the examples and the layman's terms description or definition of them. And then under that, I would say, like, this is um, a social family bias, or this is um, an example of a informal fallacy of the relevance fallacy family, specifically of the red herring uh, category. I could break it down like that. Hopefully, my heater's not making too much noise so you can't hear me over it. Um, but yeah, so class them as family and types, and then a description of how to defend against those fallacies, biases, and moral wrongs, ethical wrongs. Um, and that's a really good layout. It's very similar to encountering a monster in a role playing game, which is funny because um, I've kind of had this sort of nagging feeling in the back of my head that it would be totally worthwhile to see if I could turn this into some kind of game at some point where you encounter these monsters, these wrongs in some personified form, and you have to use spells to overcome them, which would be the debiasing or the resolution of fallacies. So I think it would be fun to maybe do a game out of it, but that's too much on my plate already. I'm still thinking. Um, I still think it would be fun to do some sort of icon or graphic representation and anthropomorphization of each of these things. But it's really hard because a lot of these are very abstract concepts. Looking at a list of biases, you have things like the anchoring bias, and like you could do a literal drawing of an anchor, like a role playing game Mimic, where the treasure chest with eyes and angry teeth on it. You can do an anchor with eyes and teeth, and that one's a little bit easier to do. It doesn't tell you anything about the actual what anchoring bias is. Um, and like there's some of them that like you you're just not going to be able to find a graphic representation that you can do well. And so I feel like it would be cutting out a whole lot more work, especially if I do 100 fallacies and 100 biases and the 20 to 25 moral ethical wrongs. Um, you know, that's much much more work to do 240 icons. And I mean, maybe doing just icons for the categories, um, like some pictographic or ideographic symbol for the social, the behavioral, or the memory-based um, biases, and the formal and informal with the 3 categories for formal and the 4, 5 for informal, having a logo or a ideogram for each of those, sort of like the elements. You would say like the earth, the plant, the water, the electric, the fire Pokemon. Um, Having a means of indicating those have those capabilities, those talents, those abilities. Um, that's referring to Pokemon. Um, the Pokemon have abilities in those categories, and so the best counteracting on those are to use strategies that are best against that type of Pokemon. So to do something like that for this, these are the categories of your bias or fallacy. And these are the best countering mechanisms that work best against those categories of um, wrongs. And doing that, it gives you some of that iconography that you can use to recognize things, and it gives something for your memory to adhere to too. It's giving some kind of visual representation sometimes really helps you remember a thing and how to handle it. And so I think that would be useful if you did if, if I did that. Um, could I then do modifications of those icons for each subtype of fallacy or bias? I'd have to really, really look through. Like, it really looks like so many of them are so abstract. Being able to say this is a, social type, and like then trying to say like, okay, so this is, expecting that there will be other people there to take care of the situation. It's the, you know, if you're in a crowd and you're wandering around and you see somebody injured, you could just keep walking because you assume there are 40 other people here. Somebody will help them. That's sort of like a false belief, and there's no guarantee that happens. And it's like being able to shirk any responsibility for your fellow human being because it defuses the responsibility amongst the group, and everybody else thinks somebody else will take care of it. How do you represent that with an icon? I I can't think of a simple, and like that's one out of 240 some odd examples of things to play with for this first volume, and an additional, 180 something for the next volume. It's it's too many to do, and too many of them are such abstract representations that they become really difficult to do that way. Um, but I, I feel like there ought to be some form of visual marker for them. I don't know how I'm going to do that, but I can't spend the next 2 days banging my head against that wall. I've got to finish writing the examples and the definitions and the strategies for dealing with each one of these. And I can do it for all of them right now over the next few days, um, and just trim off the ones I don't think I want to include. If I decide I want to go with the 90 biases and 70 some odd fallacies, I can just trim off ones that I will put in the second volume. Um, but I do think I'm gonna go back over a lot of them and sort out like the priority examples for each. And if it feels like I hit a point around like 80 where I've gotten all the ones that seem like they're the most relevant and most useful, I might include a few more, just to get you know, prioritize them, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like, most important to here's a good cutoff point to establish for the next volume. And it looks like if I do everything right, this should all fit well and easily into 2 volumes, which is nice because I think that would be a good number of uh, books to cover the topic. It's forms a nice pairing, doesn't make either book oversized, And at a later date, if I wanted to compile them into a master, an omnibus volume, I should be able to make a 450 to 500-page master volume, collecting volumes 1 and 2 together. Certainly easy enough to do. And I don't imagine I'll have to do a lot of updating by adding new fallacies or new biases in later volumes. Like, there won't be like a 5th edition where, like, with 25 new biases and 14 new fallacies suddenly added to it. Maybe. I'm not that up on the history of fallacies and biases. Seriously, dude, you can stop with the heater. Sorry. But I don't think they get that many new categories on a regular basis. I will have to listen back to this to see if that heater's a problem. If this is a problem, now you stop. If this is hard on audio, I'll try to turn it off before future episodes of this. Anyway, where was I? So right now it's prioritizing which are the most valuable and important ones to include in volume 1. And as long as we don't cut it down to, like, I could do, like, volume 1 could be 17 biases, 20 moral, and oh no, what? I think the biases was like 20 something, and the fallacies, the formal fallacies, were 17. And like that would be a super short volume, and volume 2 would be this massive tome of everything else. But a lot of the informal fallacies are the ones that we're most familiar with. We encounter them more often. Straw man, that's an informal. That's not a formal fallacy. So I feel like I need to do a little bit of everything, and it's finding the good cutoff point. And I think, as I mentioned yesterday, one of the issues with that is it's not really an issue, I don't think. I guess it's just a quirk, is as something that requires a judgment by the writer or the compiler of this list, I'm subject to personal bias on my own experiences and way of interacting with the world. And so there is inherently, I guess the best way to put this is, I'm going to get it wrong. For somebody else who reads this book, I will have done it wrong. And there are methods for debiasing that. But I think that's somewhere that's something that comes along in if you're doing this thing as a scholarly work, you're going to debias your work by consulting and interacting and getting feedback from 10, 20 other people in the field with different perspectives and different standpoints, so you can diffuse some of the debias some aspects of what you're doing. But I'm not writing a scholarly work, and it's okay to be a little bit wrong in the order that I do these things, if in the end I still benefit the vast majority of people who encounter the work. Now, this isn't going to be a textbook in a classroom. It's not good. I mean, if a teacher wants to use this as an intro get you started on the concept and then do it right in class. If you're teaching a class on business ethics, the I think 5 or 7 professional ethic categories that are in what I'm going to use here. If those lay them out in layman's terms for my mother or my niece to understand and get at least a basic understanding of them, that's the goal for that. And if a teacher in a class teaches business ethics and they introduce that concept and then say like that's a gross oversimplification of these concepts and we're going to go into them in more detail now, that's actually fine by me. That's sort of what I'm aiming for. Like, I am not going to break down the history of what is it, Kant and some other philosophers who debate whether or not there can be a sort of universal ethical moral standpoint, that it's all personal, and uh, I, I don't want to hash those details out. The goal for me isn't for you to understand the history of um, environmental stewardship as an ethical, a global ethical principle. I don't. You don't need to know the names and dates in history that influenced the thought on that topic. What I need you to get from this is this something that is applicable to your life to recognize a wrong with regard to environmental stewardship? And if you recognize those wrongs, ways of addressing them and seeing them as something to be managed or resolved. Is it applicable? And if so, how? The history and the mechanics and the nitty gritty details and how it came to be that way. Teachers and uh, governmental and professional ethics can cover that. That's not what I'm doing. That's not what this book is, and I don't think that's where the most value from covering this topic will come for the average consumer. The idea of what Kant thought about one's ethical responsibilities to their environment, it's not valuable to most people. Knowing that uh, looking at one's environment and acknowledging that it's potentially wrong to misuse your environment in such a way that it's not sustainably um, sound, that's a useful piece of information for anybody to get. Whether they choose to act on it is their own thing. And um, if you choose to address a wrong in that category, what methods can you apply to it? That's far more important to me. And so that's sort of my focus on this. And that's the bulk of the work now. Like up till now, it's really been sourcing, collecting, organizing, and prioritizing uh, what is it? Uh, about a 400 item long list of different types of wrongs and categorized sections of wrongs. Now it's translating and it's more creative writing. And that takes more time. Gathering information, it's easier than processing the information. So the bulk of the work is going to be happening now. Alrighty, well, I'm at 40 minutes, so either this topic is getting more interesting to me to talk about, or I'm getting better at doing a live stream rambling discussion. I don't know. I don't know if either of those are true. I might be wrong on that one. Um, I might just be better at blathering endlessly for long minutes of time. Uh, all right, so that's sort of where I am right now. I'm hoping that over the next 3 days to be able to make that final decision on the size of each list for volume one and translate each a little bit better into a single page entry with an example, a definition in layman's terms, the families and categories it belongs to, and methodology for debiasing or resolving fallacies or moral wrongs. Um, and then I do want to write the first chapter with the defining, explaining why we shouldn't be as afraid of uh, as afraid of being wrong, and ways to the right way to be wrong. That is more of an opening set of essays that I have to write too, and so that's all a lot of creative writing, and so that's going to be more time consuming. That sounds like a negative way to say that, but it's going to take like writing. What is it? Writing 5,000 words, I think, takes me about 2 hours, 2.5 hours. So doing that would be rather grueling to get a 200 page, yeah, 210 to 220 page book out of this. That's a lot of writing. Hoping to do that over the next 3 days and finish up the writing by the end of the week so that I can start doing the reaching out to beta readers and I'll do my spell check and grammar check myself and do a once over proofread to catch any of my bumbling errors with writing. And then once I've done that, I will pass it on to beta readers and maybe an editor to see if they can clean up anything that I'm unable to see because I'm too close to the work. And after that, it's really more like a wait and adjust based off of feedback as time goes by. So hopefully, over the subsequent 2 to 3 weeks, I will get enough of a response back in order to be able to do a final version to be for sale by the end of the month. Here's hoping. All right. Worst comes to worst, there's always next month too to do any finishing up. All right. I think I'll end it here for today. I will be back tomorrow to cover more of what I've done, and I will see anybody then. Have a good one.